Well, Janet, I think we are hopefully good to go. I know we've got people joining from all over the world today. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and a very warm welcome to this webinar, co-hosted with Janet Mertens from the Josh Bersin Company. Janet, perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yes, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Janet Mertens. Great to be here with you, Jim. I am the Senior Vice President of Research at the Josh Bersin Company and have been working closely with Jim and the AMS team on this exciting new piece of research, and we're looking forward to exploring it with you today.
We are indeed. Thank you, Janet. So I'm Jim Sykes and I lead client operations here at AMS. For those of you that don't know AMS, we do two things, and I like to think we do them incredibly well. We provide talent acquisition solutions and talent advisory services. We support around 200 clients in more than 90 countries around the world. And last year, for example, for our enterprise clients alone, we hired something in the region of 200,000 experienced staff, in addition to around 25,000 early career hires and around 15,000 contingent worker placements. As you can imagine, the scale of that activity gives us some really unique insight into hiring markets around the world. It continues to be a remarkable period for those of us working in talent acquisition. We have navigated the COVID epidemic, the dramatic reductions in hiring that took place, and the corresponding furloughs and layoffs. We then navigated the rebound and the subsequent great resignation, which obviously led to unprecedented hiring volumes across most sectors and geographies. A period in which, I don't need to remind you, a period in which talent acquisition professionals were more in demand than software engineers. And I'm not convinced we'll ever see that time again. We are now, most of us, navigating a period of hiring reductions. A period in which economic uncertainty, coupled with an increase in cost of living, has reduced corporate growth and reduced attrition as employees hold tight to their existing roles. Without a doubt, this has been the most turbulent period in my 25 years in talent acquisition. At AMS, we are referring to these continual changes within the market as the talent climate. And we're really proud to be working with Janet and the Josh Bersin Company on an exclusive series of data-driven reports that explore the continuing changes in the talent climate and the impact of those changes on companies and talent leaders. Janet and I are delighted to have with us today two special guests that we're going to introduce to the virtual stage in a few minutes. Both of them distinguished talent leaders. They're going to help us, I'm sure, make sense of the current talent climate. We have Teresa Beach, who is the HR Chief Operating Officer at Marsh & McLennan, and we have Michael Durrance, the Senior HR Manager for Talent at Santander. They're going to join us shortly. Firstly, a little housekeeping, if I may. Somewhere on your screen, I'm guessing bottom right, but I couldn't be certain, somewhere on your screen, you should have access to a question chat box. Please do share with us any questions you have, questions for Janet or myself or for our panelists. We will do our utmost to get to as many questions as we can in the course of the webinar today. So, before I hand over to Janet to introduce the findings of our new report, let me, if I may, touch briefly on our previous report that focused on time to hire. The report contains comprehensive benchmarking data that gives insight into time to hire trends by region, by sector, and for specific skills and role types. The key finding of the report, as you can see on your screen, was that despite the changing talent climate, despite the cooling jobs market that we're experiencing today, time to hire has continued to increase consistently by a day a year for each year since 2019. Put simply, it's getting harder to hire. Now, I share this with you now as with reduced hiring levels in 2023, with increased time to hire and with hiring getting harder, one may assume that the proportion of roles that are hired internally may be increasing. I'll let Janet talk to that point in 1 second. The last report that we published together generated a huge amount of discussion and debate, and I am very confident that our second report will do the same. So with that in mind, let me hand over to Janet to share the key findings of our second talent climate report. Janet.
Fabulous. Thanks, Jim. Well, and what I love about the two slides kind of going from one to the next is that chart on the right. I mean, it's really quite striking, the kind of the difference in the signal around internal hiring. So, I think you put it really well to say this is perhaps the most fascinating, exciting, bumpy time that we've seen in a long time in talent acquisition. And, a lot of what we are looking at and watching in the market at the Josh Bersin company is really what are those components that are coming together to help organizations build and kind of maintain this a workforce that's going to help them thrive in this new post-industrial uncertain landscape that we find ourselves in. So, as you mentioned, Jim, we looked at, oh goodness, almost a little over 500,000 data points, right, to really uncover in this edition of our Talent Climate series what's going on in terms of internal hiring. And to your point, as we saw external hiring, and it continues to be a real challenge for organizations, we really wanted to look at, okay, what's going on then internally? Are organizations tapping into internal talent? We know that there's a need for this. We know it's top of mind for organizations. In fact, at JBC, we've been asking the question for years now about how organizations look at internal hiring. And, almost across the board, we hear it's top of mind, it's a priority. Organizations recognize that moving people around, upskilling, growing people, and tapping into internal talent is crucial. And yet, when we look at the data, and you can see it here in a really striking way, we're seeing a downturn, a bit of a reduction in that momentum to really hire from within, to move people around, to grow them. So, we're going to talk a little bit about why that is, but let me just share a little bit more about what you'll find in the report. And you can, I believe, we'll put a link to the report somewhere in the session today for you to download. But really, what we wanted to look at is, what are organizations doing when it comes to their internal hiring rates? And over the past 5 years, so we've been able to look at data over, since before the pandemic, there was a real surge, I would say, in 2020, and for all the reasons we know, as companies froze hiring during the height of the pandemic, companies really turned inward to look at how to make the most of the talent that they have in 2020. But that momentum has really slowed. It's actually, dropped quite significantly. And so as we started to look over the course of the last few years, and certainly in 2022 and 2023, we've been able to show benchmark data. We've been able to show you, and definitely it's a great resource and a reference for how you might compare to your industry peers, to your regional peers, or even by particular roles or job families. What are the benchmarks? What are companies across the world doing today in terms of how much internal hiring they are able to execute on? Couple of other things that are really interesting. So yes, the numbers are dropping, but this is not a bad news story. And Jim, we've talked about this. The name of the webinar really is a bright spot in the storm. As we think about the opportunities going forward, there is a lot of opportunity here, I think, for organizations to improve their internal hiring processes, to build a culture of growth. And we've got a number of examples and actions that you can take. Plus, we've got our panelists today who are going to talk about what they are doing in their own organizations to build on their internal hiring rates. The other thing that's really interesting, Jim, that I want to point out in this research, so we've got the benchmark data, which is a great place to start, but we've also been able to look a little bit more deeply. We went under the hood, if you will, in the data to understand what's happening in terms of hiring times when we compare internal versus external hiring. And there's a lot of kind of paradoxes. I would say there's a paradox in the market around, what's faster, finding people internally or finding people externally. And we certainly know we're in a time of talent scarcity now. But for some organizations, it's incredibly challenging to find people internally because the visibility to skills or what, what capabilities or who is in your organization is sometimes a little bit of a challenge. So we have a really interesting, Jim, you'll remember too, in the report, we have a really interesting analysis that we've been able to do around specific circumstances or insights that you can be using in your organization to really help you optimize where are those places, those roles, those regions where internal hiring might actually save you, a significant amount of time, or where, external hiring and internal hiring might actually be equivalent. So it really helps you kind of figure out what those strategies are to bring in internal talent and external talent in, sort of a balanced way. Let me think, Jim, is there anything else we want to kind of highlight? In anything else you want to add about the research itself?
Yeah, Janet, you know what, the only thing I think before we bring our panelists out, one of the points that I would raise is, as you and I were looking at this data, having done the analysis on time to hire, and we saw this significant drop in internal hiring. And we should probably say, for the people who haven't read it, on the bottom right-hand side of the screen there, internal hiring is a really simple measurement. We're looking at the proportion of roles that are filled within the applicant tracking system that were filled with internal candidates, which typically means they're going through a full competitive process. But the immediate thing we thought was that there would be an obvious correlation between the internal hiring percentage and the total volume of hires that are made. And post-COVID, where we saw a significant kind of spike in hiring, we've seen a reduction in internal hiring because internally we just can't fulfill the same proportion of roles internally. So that was our assumption. But then, of course, we then looked at 2023 and we looked at the year to date. And as I said in my opening comments, we know that hiring volumes have reduced significantly this year on 2022 and 2021. So that hypothesis clearly doesn't hold true, because if there was a strong correlation to the volume of hires, we would have seen a significant increase in internal mobility in 2023. We haven't seen that with the year-to-date data, which covered the first half of 2023. And Janet, I think the glimpses of data that I've seen heading into kind of Q3 have not shown any similar trends. So I think that's a really interesting piece of context for people. There should be a correlation with hiring volumes, but the correlation may not be as strong as people would assume it would be.
Yeah, no, and Jim, and I think that's such an important point. And maybe, and as we kind of move to bring our panelists out, I think there are probably 3 or 4 kind of challenges that are really standing in the way for organizations. Certainly we hear about them often in our conversations, and they are not just process challenges, right? So process barriers can stand in the way. How do you move people around? How do you measure their performance? How do you pay them as they move around the organization? But there are also tech challenges or tech barriers that organizations talk about around how do you help signal what opportunities exist for the organization beyond the internal post and pray method. And then there's a cultural piece, and we're going to dig into all of this with our panelists, but the culture of mobility is also an opportunity where organizations can really be rethinking how do they incentivize, how do they motivate, how do they encourage movement and growth and develop people inside the organization so they are ready to make moves.
Absolutely agree. Perfect. So on that note, let me quickly remind everyone who's joined the webinar that you have a question chat functionality. If you have any questions at any point for Janet or for myself or for our panelists, please do use that question functionality. I will be keeping a close eye on the questions and feeding them in to our panelists as we go. And that being said, let me invite to the virtual stage Teresa and Michael. Please, guys, come and join us when you're able. Ah, there we go.
Hello,
and you're both with us. Thank you so much for joining. We're genuinely delighted to have you with us. Perhaps I can start by asking you to introduce yourselves. Teresa, how about you go first?
Thank you. It's a delight to be with you both and the audience. So I'm Teresa Beach. I work for Marsh McLennan, and for Marsh McLennan, I am our Chief Operating Officer for Human Resources, People Function globally, and that includes, amongst a range of responsibilities, our talent acquisition, our hiring globally.
Fantastic. Thank you, Teresa. Michael.
Good afternoon, Jim. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Michael Laurent. I lead the internal recruitment team at Santander in the UK, and I have the pleasure of doing having two parts to my day job. The first part is the talent acquisition side of it, but also then the second part is the learning and development side. So we prepare our colleagues to take that next step in their journey and their career.
Fantastic. I have a suspicion we might be coming back to that topic very quickly, Michael. But perhaps we start with a broad question. The whole focus of our second talent climate report is obviously on internal hiring. You both had an advanced copy of the report, and you've heard our preliminary comments. I'd love to hear from both of you. One, how do you view the importance of internal mobility and internal hiring within your organizations? And secondly, I guess kind of the data and the research that we've shared is an aggregate of a huge amount of global data. I'm really curious as to whether the trends resonate with you as you look at your own organizations. Teresa, perhaps you first.
Okay, thank you. Well, Marsh McLennan is a people business. We've got 100,000 employees and associates globally. And so we can only thrive as an organization through the specialist, experienced, kind of domain expert professionals that we've got across all our businesses. So our ability to hire from within is paramount, particularly as the demand for skills increases. And as you've already said in your introductory comments, the marketplace is just getting tougher and tougher. We do know, we believe that increasing our rate of internal hiring can lead to a more sustained, more creative careers for colleagues. It'll drive up engagement, and that enabling colleagues to develop their careers within Marsh McLennan is an accelerator for business growth. So it's a real win-win. We know when colleagues choose to leave us that we're losing people who not only know us, but know our clients, who fit our culture, who have the skills that we need and that our clients value. So it's a real priority for us. Picking up on your second question, Jim, I think it's also an area we know we can do better. So in 2023, we filled about 1 in 5 of our vacancies globally with an internal appointment. The best we achieved in our best performing region, our best performing business, was about 30%. But interestingly, we haven't seen a drop in our internal hiring rates from 2022 to 2023. On the whole, we've just seen a very slight uptick in 1 or 2 areas, but generally quite small ones. We've seen a reasonably significant uptick, but we haven't seen a drop. But we still know we've got room to do quite a lot better, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thank you. Some really interesting points, Teresa, and we'll come back to a couple of them shortly. Michael, how do you view the world within Santander?
I think Teresa described it really nicely when she said it was a win-win, and I think that's absolutely how we at Santander here see internal hiring as well. But that hasn't always been the case, and I think we recognised certainly during the pandemic the benefit of internal hiring. All the great people that actually, 1, stayed with the organisation, but then 2, moved roles. And at one point during the pandemic, our internal hiring was at 90%. So hugely important to us. And we have seen, to pick up on the second part to your question, we have seen that trend kind of follow the line down, as Janet mentioned earlier on. But actually overall, we're still maintaining reasonably high levels of internal hiring, and certainly haven't gone back to our pre-pandemic level yet. And we're still hiring certainly non-entry level roles. 60% of people are internal movers within the organisation.
Okay, well, that's amazing.
We're doing really well, but at the same time, I think to Teresa's point, that there's certainly more that we can be doing.
Yeah. So let's, if we may, let's explore a little bit what internal hiring looks like within organizations. And I've tried to be a little bit provocative with some of the commentary that we've kind of put into the market alongside this report, in saying that in my 25 years in talent acquisition, I've seen so much innovation when it comes to technology and hiring processes and automation and the segmentation of the way that we deliver our services. But predominantly 90 of that innovation feels to me to be focused on how we go to the external market to hire talent. And I would argue that we've seen far less innovation when it comes to the way that we hire talent internally. And actually, some might argue that internal candidates are often at a disadvantage because in most organizations, they can't be headhunted, whereas they can be headhunted if they're out in the external market. I'd love to get your sense of how does internal hiring differ from external hiring, and should it differ? Who'd like to respond first?
Well, I'm really keen to learn from Michael, because Michael actually has a real focus on internal hiring. So let Michael go first on this one, and then I'll
yeah. And Michael, as you're exploring, I mean, one of the things that I think our audience would love to hear too is, what are those barriers that you've had to overcome to get to those kinds of numbers? I mean, what does that, whether it's cultural or process or technology, where are you really putting that priority to help get those numbers up?
Yeah, I think what you just mentioned there, Janet, is really key, because I don't think we can look at internal hiring as just the recruitment transaction that happens. You need to, and what we've tried to do is unpick all the parts of the HR machine that goes behind recruitment. So that could be the recruitment process, but that's also about candidates having visibility of the opportunities and what it's like to work elsewhere, through to how do our HR policies help, or in some cases not always help, the candidates, the internal talent move within the organization. And that really is what's struck a chord with me and our HR team here, to think about internal hiring now differently. And that's what we've been on a journey this year to really start, which is up until May really of this year, the internal candidate experience was exactly the same as an external one. So you had the CV SIF, the competency-based interview, and we recognised that actually that doesn't always allow our internal talent to flourish. Somebody that might have been in the organisation for a number of years, actually getting them in front of a hiring manager for an interview doesn't always enable them to shine. And that's what we've tried to do through some of the things that we've done to help people to be more relaxed, to not have those competency-based interviews that are going to put them on the spot and really put them under pressure, and be more informal about our approach to internal hiring to really enable our talent to shine. But at the same time, preparing people managers for that change as well, because it's two ways here, isn't it? It's not just about the candidate experience, it's about the manager experience of recruitment as well.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And Jim, if I can, and Teresa, maybe you can share a little bit more about this. We hear a lot in our conversations around talent hoarding, right? So to your point around helping managers really understand the value of developing and moving people around, that might mean, moving someone out of the department, the team, et cetera. Teresa, I'd love to hear from you on that same note. How are you handling, or are you seeing any of that with people managers, with functional managers, with talent hoarding, or is that a barrier for you?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I think it is possibly one of the most challenging and significant barriers, if I'm honest. And I understand why. So as a manager in an organization with all of the challenges and headwinds that we all face today, the value of a stable, efficient, performant team is immeasurable. And so for managers who are concerned that perhaps there are constraints on adding new headcount, and therefore if they lose a colleague, will they or won't they be able to replace that colleague? They've got a team that's working well today, the team dynamics work well. The idea of actually actively disturbing that is a threat. And I really understand why that acts as a brake on what a hiring manager would be, what a people manager would be minded to do. And I think that's the challenge for us as organizations, is to flip the mindset from one that's focusing on stability today to one that's focusing on growth tomorrow, and recognizing and providing the incentives and the frameworks that promote the ability for managers and colleagues to actively look for their next their next opportunity. And we've got ideas about what those solutions might be, but it is a culture and mindset issue. It's not a technology and a process issue.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and interestingly, one of our audience members, Jill Montgomery, had raised exactly that question. What examples have we seen in the marketplace of best practice when it comes to incentivizing or encouraging line managers not to hoard talent? Michael, on that specific point, is there anything that you're doing to incentivize that behavior or drive that culture?
I think kind of one of the things that we will be doing over the course of the next few weeks, months, and probably years is acknowledging that succession planning and talent management will play a key role in enabling managers to think about the gaps that they might have in the future, and therefore where the people that might fill those gaps in the future are. And we do that really well at the senior levels in the organisation at the moment, but it's not a habit that we're in across the organisation, and I think it's something that, you know, over time, with support, effort, and a bit of encouragement, shall I say, will sort of help support more mobility and breaking down some of those barriers. But it's not the only solution.
Yeah, agreed. Janet, it is fascinating, and the Josh Bersin company, I think, do an amazing job of articulating how the market is shifting, and you know, the changing nature of skills, the very simple fact that birth rates in many countries are now decreasing to the point where GDP in theory outstrips growth, which means that we physically will not have enough workers to fulfill the jobs. And I just wonder if we as talent leaders do a good enough job of articulating actually the nature of the market to our managers and explaining to them that there's an imperative on us to retain our talent and to find ways of upskilling and reskilling our talent, because we just can't rely anymore on going to market and hiring job-ready talent from our competitors.
I think you're spot on, Jim. I mean, that is exactly the conversations that we're having now in the market around, you know, talent scarcity has been around for some time, but it's going to be with us for a long time. This is not a short-term problem. And so I think for organizations, you know, we talk to a lot of organizations who are getting this right. I mean, you know, both of you, Michael and Teresa, are among the conversations we're having around leaders who see this and are pushing forward. And I think one of the themes we see repeatedly is this knowledge or acknowledgement that we are in a very different moment. We call it the post-industrial era, you know, at JBC, with talent scarcity and the pressures of explosions of technology and industries converging, and, you know, everyone competing for the same talent. Tech talent being a huge requirement as organizations transform digitally. And one of the themes that we see repeat themselves in our pace setters, in our level 4 North Star companies, is the need to be creative, right? To think differently about our talent models, our recruiting processes, and how we think about talent in general.
Agreed. Thank you, Janet.
If I can add to that, Janet, I think increasingly it's not just about reskilling and upskilling, but I think it's going to be about redesigning jobs as well, and recognizing that the mix and the way that you think about work and how you deploy work to the resources, both human and non-human, that you've got available is going to change. So it's sort of equipping managers to think in that broadest sense about how they solve the work that needs to be done.
Well, and Teresa, I mean, you and I have talked about our systemic HR approach, right? So that the boundaries of recruiting or skilling and learning, Michael, you talked about, you know, having both sides of that. We talk about it as the 4 R's, right? So what are and we talk, you know, recruiting, retaining, reskilling, and redesigning are all levers that are related. And so as we think about what a talent challenge is that we need to solve, it's not necessarily any one of those in isolation. It really is a combination. So I think that's exactly spot on.
Let's, if I may, I'm going to take a question from the audience, because it's a topic that a theme that I think flows quite nicely. Chris Smith has raised a question and said, we still tend to focus on internal hiring as being colleague driven. I'd be interested in your thoughts on how organizations upskill and move colleagues into roles in the future as we see more automation of transactional roles. So I think it's similar theme, but it's a very interesting concept. To what extent, perhaps two angles to this. You can perhaps reflect on how this works within your organizations today, or equally conceptually, what do we think great would look like? To what extent do we think internal hiring should be employee driven versus a facilitated process, either through talent teams within HR or through talent acquisition teams who might be able to headhunt internally? Michael, do you have an initial view?
Yeah, and I think actually moving towards that employee-driven landscape is probably the right place to go, certainly for our organisation. I think where we are now, and where many of us, I'm sure, have been for many, many years, is we've seen this as an HR and a business challenge to fix, but actually empowering employees to take more ownership and drive their own careers, whether that's within the organisation that they're in today, or whether that might be a step towards another organisation for the future. Those are absolutely kind of the things that we need to be providing people with help and support to make those moves.
Teresa, what's your view?
So I think I have a slightly different view. I think internal hiring for us today, internal mobility today, is largely colleague-led, because that's not because we have created an environment that empowers a colleague to own their own career, although clearly that's what we seek to do, but more because if you want to move internally, actually the incentive is with the colleague to go and look at the roles that are available and to maybe pluck up the courage to talk to their existing manager and then to hire for the role, and we pick it up and take it from there. What I would really love to see, where I'd like us to get to, where we want to move to, is an environment where internal mobility is a leadership imperative. It's a leadership objective, and that leaders understand the value that comes from taking a really skills-based mindset to selection for roles, and the value of building those skills as well as hiring those skills, partly because it's cost effective, partly because it drives colleague engagement, but mostly because it enables us to drive sustainable growth. And there's lots of things that we need to do to enable that, but I really think that that's where we should be trying to get to. I think it's a leadership imperative, and the facilitation comes from all of the agencies that support leaders to grow the business.
That certainly plays to the cultural aspect that we talked about before, doesn't it? If we want to create a culture in which this approach to internal mobility and drive towards kind of upskilling, reskilling, presumably we would feel that needs to come from the top.
Completely.
Well, and there was something else that, Teresa, you mentioned, and I think, Michael, you talked about as well, is the psychological safety, right, of employees and or leaders being comfortable moving people around, putting their hands up for roles. I mean, we've heard stories, cautionary tales of employees who have felt retaliation because they have expressed a desire to, or a manager who has, encouraged movement. And when we, from a management perspective, when our systems or our processes around measuring success in managers is really performance driven and not necessarily, doesn't have a focus on growth or development of the team, that can be a real challenge. So for managers or for employees, that psychological safety is pretty critical.
Absolutely, and we support our managers, we train our managers, we coach our managers to promote those sort of conversations, promote those career conversations with their team members, in order to identify aspirations, identify potential future career paths, whether those are linear or otherwise. I think there's more to do beyond just providing the training and the good practice advice for how managers can be good managers. I think we need to celebrate the success stories. We need to create incentives for managers to promote colleagues to move. We need to ensure that when managers do promote a colleague into a new opportunity in another team, there's support to enable them to replace that capability, preferably again with another internal move. We need to encourage our recruiters to lead with internal candidate search, and ensure that managers understand that when that happens, actually that's for good reasons and not a threat. You know, I think there's a whole ecosystem of changes that need to happen in order to shift the dial fundamentally.
I would, Teresa, so I'd love to pick up on that point, and we'll move on in a second and talk about technology, and there are a couple of really great questions from the audience on technology. But you were just saying we should better empower recruiters to lead conversations, in particular when it comes to internal hiring. So one of the big discrepancies between internal and external hiring today is where we have talent acquisition teams in our organizations. They are typically empowered with all kinds of kind of cool tools and techniques to go into the external marketplace and find passive talent and approach that passive talent and sell a role to the passive talent. But typically they're not empowered to do that within their own organizations. And I did see some great data from LinkedIn that showed that the proportion of recruiters who are conducting searches within their own organizations is increasing massively. And I don't know the reason for that, but I can only hypothesize that it's because in the absence of any other technology, LinkedIn is the best way of finding internal talent. Before we talk about the tech aspect, what's your view on the role of the recruiters today? Are your recruiters empowered to do anything other than screen internal applicants who just apply? Presumably this is all linked to cultural change. Would you like to see a change in the way that recruiters are empowered to hire internally? Michael?
Yeah, I think we're in a really fortunate position to have empowered our recruiters to be really involved in the internal recruitment process. It's almost like, you know, as a manager, there's a way that you have access to your talent, and internal talent is one of those sources of people that are going to fill the vacancies as a manager that you might have. So the recruiters play a really key role in helping the manager find that internal talent using some of the tech that we've got available to us.
Okay, great. So it sounds like you're already quite far down that particular path. Teresa, what about you?
So our recruiters are hungry for it. They would love to be able to tap into the internal talent market as readily as they can the external talent market. And there are some parts of business where that's welcomed, and others where they know they need to proceed with a little more discretion and caution, to be honest. I actually, Janet's heard me say this before, I use myself as a poster child. If somebody was looking at, somebody internally within Marsh McLennan was looking at my profile, they would assume that I'm an HR professional with deep HR expertise because of the roles that I've held within Marsh McLennan, which have all been HR roles. Actually, I didn't hold HR roles until I moved to Marsh McLennan, and so there's a whole depth of other experience which is not available if actually all you know is what I've done in my role today. And there are many, many, many people in all our organisations that are in exactly that position.
Yeah.
Well, that's go ahead, Jim.
No, go, Janet, please.
I was going to say, and that's such a great segue, because I know we're going to talk about tech next, but that visibility is a real, it's a real challenge for organizations, Teresa, to your point, around what are the skills, the hidden skills, expertise, capabilities, experience that you bring to the table, and how do we equip recruiters to have, to have access to that information, to that insight, to be able to then go back to hiring managers and talk about what are the, internal versus external candidates. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly that. So we got a number of questions actually from the audience on technology, and I'll pick the first one I have in my list here, which is from Tom Stiles, who says, do you have an opinion about the value of technology tools such as internal talents, marketplace solutions that are being promoted as helping companies source internal talent? Janet, I'm actually going to turn that one to you because you have a great anecdote, if you're happy to share it, or a great example of an organization that you shared with me before that is pretty brave when it comes to their way of kind of looking internally rather than going externally.
Boy, Tim, I'm trying to remember which anecdote you're referring to now. I mean, there's a couple, and I think you might be referring to the, are you thinking about the deli counter story, or are you thinking about the one where they break down the roles into components?
That one.
Okay. We've heard some really fantastic, again, creative practices. But there is an organization that we have spoken to who, and again, it's the idea, Teresa, to your point earlier around rethinking the work itself, right? So as you are filling, a role internally, we talked to an organization who shared that they are starting with leaves in particular, but as they have a leave, and an opening because of a leave, they are actually, rather than backfilling that role externally or internally as a whole job, they are taking that opportunity between TA and the business and the hiring manager to break down that job into its component parts. What is the work being done in that job? What are the skills and capabilities in component parts that job entailed? And then gigging that work out, making those opportunities available and visible to the organization so that they may be filling that role with 3 or 4 folks who are, maybe doing 20% or 10%. And it's a really bold way to really think about the work itself and break out of the perhaps traditional job description that may have been around for 20 years.
Yeah. But Janet, that approach, I would assume, relies on having a tech platform that gives you some insight into the skills that you have within your organization and creates a market for managers to be able to look for internal talents and for internal talent.
And that's exactly right, Jim. So Talent Marketplace, I mean, that is an incredibly full industry, and Talent Marketplaces, I think, when we talk to organizations that work best, are being used beyond just the core job itself, right? So the gig, the cross-functional assignments, the rotations, the stretch assignments and project-based work really encourages that culture of growth. And that's how this company happens to be able to enable or facilitate. Love to hear from Michael and Teresa if you are using a Talent Marketplace, and how are you doing that for internal?
That's a very easy question for me to answer. In the moment, we're not using a talent marketplace, but that's one of the benefits for Santander being part of a global group, in that that's something that the group will be introducing to all businesses next year. So that global talent marketplace then stretches not just in the UK, but around the globe, and our businesses there.
Exciting.
Fantastic. Yeah, really exciting.
And we are absolutely piloting talent marketplace technologies in specific. We've done a couple of pilots in specific businesses, and there we have an aspiration to roll out a global solution in the not too distant future. I think I always come back to a caution that it's part of the solution, not the whole solution.
Yeah.
I think it's very attractive to feel that if we provide this capability, that's going to unlock the internal talent market. And I don't think it will, unless we have all the other things we've talked about that will help to provide colleagues with the skills development that they need in order to have confidence in looking internally, the leadership role modeling, the manager behavior, the supportive frameworks that enable people to step into an internal recruitment process with confidence, and so it's part of, but not the whole solution.
Agreed.
There were a few more comments and questions around technology. Someone's asked a question as to whether you've started talent pooling internal talent. I guess that's kind of connected with the technology as well, because with this technology, there's less of a need to proactively talent pool because the mapping is already there, I would assume.
I mean, I can jump in. I think I'm understanding that question. Jim, give it to me one more time because I don't see it on the screen.
So the question the question was, have the panelists started talent pooling internal talent, so proactively reaching out and keeping talent warm in advance of a requirement? And kind of my point was, with the right technology, that kind of activity may not be necessary. And experience tells me that there aren't many organizations doing that today, other than potentially with internal silver medalists. But Teresa, Michael, do you have a particular approach when it comes to talent pooling, internal talent?
We're not doing that today. Sorry, shall I finish?
No, go on, Teresa.
So we're not doing that today, but I would see a place for doing that in the future, particularly as we develop more and more sophisticated models to workforce plan, actually understanding where the core skills are in our organisation that will provide the foundation blocks for what we will need in the future, and how we can approach pools of people in order to give them an opportunity to add new skills that will equip them. I think actually pooling of talent internally becomes even more powerful.
Agreed. Michael, any differing view?
No, nothing different. I think you mentioned silver medalists within the recruitment process, and that's something that we've tapped into in the past. But there are, as Teresa's just mentioned, more that can certainly be done to talent pool in the organisation and make the benefit of the talent we have inside.
Yeah. Great.
Jim, maybe I'll give an example of an organization, and it's the deli counter story, actually, as I'm kind of alluded to before, where organization, an organization we spoke to is proactively engaging their internal talent to skill up, to take on, lateral moves, et cetera. And the way they position it, and which I love, is that it's a deli counter culture where you go up to a deli counter, you take a number, and you're going to be served, and you're going to have choices, and you don't need to kind of push and shove, and there's an equity piece to this, right? So everyone has that opportunity. And the way they started with pockets of the organization, but they set up their internal employees as as at a deli counter to go and get their number, and as they get to the front of the counter, they are given opportunities to upskill. There's career coaching and signaling of future skills that are critical to the organization. They're given opportunities to select from a variety of projects, even if the work is not immediate or it's not a long-term gig. It's really starting to build that momentum and that visibility for both managers and for employees. Where is the business going, and what are the opportunities for you to start preparing now for the skills you'll need in the future? So I love that one.
Yeah, I really like it too. And just the nature of referring to it as the deli counter approach, right? Kind of signifies a shift in culture, which is we need to find new ways of talking about how we do this, because the old ways, feel somewhat out of date.
Yeah. And the other thing, just before we leave the tech piece, and I'm curious to hear from Michael and Teresa, is around your view on the equity piece. So we've talked to organizations who have struggled with always hitting the same people for internal assignments, for moves, for project work, and that technology can help enable, if used thoughtfully and designed well, can help enable kind of opening up the aperture a little bit and allowing for access to more of that talent pool internally. Any thoughts on that, Teresa or Michael, around how technology can help increase the equitable aspect of internal movement?
Well, Michael, you go first this time.
Oh gosh, that's a question to unpack and a half, Janet. That is. I think. Wow, where do you even start with that one? There's something for me around.
For you, Michael, just to keep things excited.
Yeah. I think for me that the role that tech can play in that is perhaps breaking down some of those boundaries that exist between the talent and the management community. And I think some of the tech that we've got and is available in the marketplace can really help break down those boundaries, because quite often when you're looking for a new role or opportunity, you don't know where to start. You don't know what another part of the business does. And by breaking down those boundaries, I think you can start to help connect more of talent with opportunities in the management community that were there.
Yeah, there's let me just throw it in. There was a question comment from Kristen O'Sullivan who said internal mobility can often be driven by more of a clique / kind of those in the know mentality. If nothing else, presumably the right technology acting in a neutral way can surface skills in a way that managers and potentially kind of talent or talent acquisition staff can't.
Absolutely.
I think that's absolutely right. I think one of the one of the enormous levelers of using technology is the equitable access it gives everyone to engage in the process in the same way. And I think there is real value in removing or providing another way in that that takes away some of the bias that will inevitably come from working in a much more manual way with who you know and who you've encountered in the organisation. So I think tech really opens the doors from an equity and a democratisation of the process, both for skills development and for internal mobility opportunities.
Yeah. Thank you, Teresa. We are running short on time, so I'm going to give you each, all three of you, if I may, one final question. If you were in an organisation today where there were no best practices from an internal mobility perspective, there was a career site where roles get posted and we just sit back and wait for applicants, and you were looking to make changes. If you could do one thing, what would that one thing be to kind of start you out on the journey? Teresa?
Oh, I've got a list of about 10.
Yeah, I know, exactly.
You really caught me out by saying what's the one thing. I think the one thing that I would do is make it a leadership imperative.
Excellent. Excellent. Michael?
I think it would be to change internal mobility away from a recruitment event and reward managers for doing the right thing. So
I love that too.
Succession planning, all those great things.
Yeah, I love that too. Thank you. Janet?
Yeah, and I'm the same. I have a list of maybe 10 things, but if I had to pick one and not repeat what my colleagues have said here, I think it's it's a little bit like Teresa's, but it's the culture piece. I think thinking about fostering that culture of mobility at the management, at the leadership level, but across the organization, that's got to come first. We've got to design this for people, for the and we the human aspect of growth, development, and movement is critical. So building that culture.
Fab. Excellent. So we are. Amazingly, we're just about out of time, and this time has gone incredibly quickly. So let me extend a huge thank you to Janet, as always, Janet, and to our panelists, Teresa and Michael. I'm absolutely convinced that everyone attending will have gained a huge amount of value from your insights. And judging by the many questions, which I apologise we didn't have time to respond to, we could have continued adding value for at least another hour. I should highlight again, Janet mentioned at the beginning, for all of you that are on the webinar today, you should be able to download a copy of the report by clicking on the floating handouts button, which I'm reliably informed looks like a document. It should be next to or under the question button. And if you then click on the PDF, that should automatically download. As soon as the webinar finishes, you will see a very short survey pop up on your screens. We would love to receive your feedback. Having registered for this session, you will receive email notifications for future events. So do please stay tuned. Having released this latest Talent Climate report, Janet and I are now rapidly thinking ahead to the next Talent Climate report, and we'll be really excited to share that with all of you in a couple of months' time. In the meantime, thank you again to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us, and have an amazing rest of the day and rest of the week, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.